Hey guys, today we're going to talk about George Washington, our nation's first president, and some of the things he accomplished while he was president. And I'm going to talk to you guys about, what I think he did that made him one of our best presidents ever. So we're going to start off here. We've got our picture. This is one of the most famous portraits of President Washington. And I think that every time I see a picture of President Washington like this, he just seems so noble and so statesmanlike. And, he just and the other thing that I notice when I look at pictures of George Washington is take a look at his facial expression. He doesn't really show much emotion, and when he was president, he really went out of his way to try to hide his emotions so people wouldn't necessarily know if he agreed or disagreed with them. And that kind of I think was a good deal to keep people from getting upset if they thought he disagreed with them because he was a hard man to read because he just didn't show very many of his emotions. Let's scroll down a little here. And this is the map, presidential electoral college map for the election of 1789 when President Washington was elected. And all of the um, colored orange, light orange states are states that he outright won. And that led to him being our nation's first president. And in those days, the candidate with the second most votes became vice president. Let's scroll on down and talk about some of the things that you maybe didn't know about Washington. First thing, the capital of the United States in those days was New York City. Washington, D.C. wasn't built yet, hadn't been planned yet. So New York City was our capital. Um, when Abraham Lincoln, let me back up. When George Washington found out he had won the election, he started to head north from his home, Mount Vernon, which is in Virginia, and he headed north. And he stopped at a lot of towns on the way, and he was greeted like the hero that he was. There were a lot of people came out to meet him as he passed through. Um, he arrived in New York City a couple of days before the inauguration. He was sworn in as our first president on April the 30th, 1789. And once he was president, the first problem he had was exactly what am I going to do as president? I mean, I know what President Washington would have thought. I know what the Constitution says I'm supposed to. It says I'm supposed to uphold the law. It says I'm supposed to be commander in chief. It says I can sign and veto laws. But what else is the president going to do on a daily basis, day to day basis? He was the first. Since he was the first president, everything he did was a setup of this is the first, this is the first, this is the first. So he set a precedent for all future presidents by doing everything first. And one of the first things he had to do was set up a presidential cabinet. And so he set up the first presidential cabinet. And what the cabinet it's not a piece of furniture. We talked about this before we were out of school. The excuse me, the president's cabinet is not a piece of furniture with doors and drawers you open up. It's a group of people that advise the president and help him run the executive branch. As you can see here on the screen, um, these are the men that were. Let me get this highlighted here. These are the men that Thomas Jefferson picked to be in his first presidential cabinet. And that was Thomas Jefferson, who became Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox became Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph was the Attorney General. And one thing that I really admire President Washington for being able to do was when he set up his cabinet, he picked two members from the Federalist Party and two members from the Democrat Party. So sorry, getting some emails there. Ignore the beeps. So, he didn't just pick a bunch of people from his political party. He picked people 50% Federalist and 50% Democrat Party. And that's something I don't know that any other president has ever done since then. Another thing that I really think that he set up really well was, and it's not laid out word for word this way in the Constitution, was he decided that the president's going to be the number one person to represent the USA with other countries. And if you look at our current president, President Trump, he does the same thing, and so did President Obama and every other president we've had since Washington. And what I mean by this is when there was negotiations needed to be done with another country, the president could represent the entire country and often does. And George Washington set that up. Another thing that George Washington did that I think made him a really great president was that he kept the United States neutral. There was a war started in 1793. Hard to believe it. France and England are going to fight another war, and President Washington said, we're not going to be part of this." And we were allies with England, well, not with England. We were allies with France because they helped us out during the Revolutionary War. And France, I think, really expected us to join in and fight England again. And President Washington said, "No, we're not going to be part of that. We're going to remain completely neutral." And that's a bold thing to do. And the United States is anything but neutral these days. And a lot of times I think President Washington was really quite wise to try to keep the United States out of problems between other countries. Another thing that he thought there was that, looking at the last on our list, he didn't think America needed political parties. And if we think about the political system in the United States today, where between the Republicans and the Democrats, how they don't get along, and how constant debate and argument prevents things from getting accomplished in our country, man, it's a shame we couldn't follow along with what President Washington thought in regards to political parties. He thought we didn't need them. Let's go back up, take another look at our picture of the president. Now this is not everything he did when he was president. These are just some of the big main things he did when he started as president. Um, Another thing he did that isn't on the list is he really set up the federal government as being stronger than the states. He put down the whiskey rebellion. That there was a tax that was put on some farmers, and they said they were going to gather together and form a militia and rebel against the federal government because they didn't want to pay this tax. And George Washington asserted the power of the federal government by sending the army and putting down that rebellion without even any battles. Once they realized George Washington was sending the army, they stopped and they paid the tax. So George Washington set up, really enforced how strong the federal government had to be to hold all the states together. And I know you guys will probably remember all the times we talked about the 13 states acting like 13 separate countries, especially during the Articles of Confederation and then during the Constitutional Convention when they were arguing and making all those debates. But things to remember. President Washington was the first president, so everything he did was a first. And he kept the United States neutral. He kept us out of wars. He set up the first presidential cabinet. He didn't want anyone to know what he was feeling, so he was really good at hiding his emotions. And he was very deliberate and careful about everything he did when he was president because he knew what he was doing was the first. I'm the first president. Everything I do is the first, and I'm setting up a precedent for all of the future presidents. And the last thing that he did was he chose to be president for 2 terms, and after those 2 terms, he chose to retire. He did not want to be looked at as a king, and he probably could have been elected president over and over and over until he passed away. But he decided that he was not going to continue to run for president. He ran for 2 terms only, and that set up a precedent for all presidents since him. All of them except for President Roosevelt during World War II. He ran more than twice, but every other president only ran twice, and it's a constitutional amendment now that presidents can only serve 2 terms, all set up by our first president, George Washington. Let's take one more quick look at him, and then we are going to close up our video.